The story of America is often told as a narrative of progress, a steady march towards equality and justice for all. Yet woven into the fabric of this narrative are dark threads, stories of exclusion, discrimination, and outright violence. One such thread, often overlooked or deliberately obscured, is the history of sundown towns, communities across the United States where, for much of the 20th century, the setting sun marked a dangerous deadline for Black Americans. These towns, through a combination of laws, intimidation and violence, were effectively off-limits to non-whites after dark. This essay delves into the unsettling history of sundown towns, exploring their origins, the methods used to enforce racial exclusion, and their lasting impact on American society. These towns were not merely a southern phenomenon, as is often assumed. They were scattered across the nation, from the rural Midwest to the Pacific Northwest, embodying a pervasive form of racism that permeated both North and South. Understanding this history is crucial, for the legacy of sundown towns extends far beyond the Jim Crow era. It continues to shape demographics, housing patterns, and social dynamics in many communities today. By shining a light on this hidden chapter of American history, we can begin to grapple with its enduring consequences and work towards a future where all citizens can live freely without fear of discrimination or violence. The first step in this process is to understand what sundown towns were and how they operated. Sundown towns were not defined by a single law or decree, but rather by a constellation of discriminatory practices, all aimed at making life untenable for Black Americans and other minorities. At the heart of this system was the threat of violence, always lurking beneath the surface of everyday life. This threat was often made explicit through signage, some towns brazenly displaying signs that read "Whites only after dark" or "Nigger, don't let the sun set on you here." These signs served as stark reminders of the racial hierarchy that governed these communities. They were not empty threats. Black Americans who dared to defy these warnings faced a range of consequences, from verbal harassment and intimidation to physical assault, arrest on trumped-up charges, or even lynching. The enforcement of these unwritten rules fell not just to law enforcement, but also to ordinary citizens, who often took it upon themselves to police the racial boundaries of their communities. The methods used to create and maintain sundown towns were varied and often insidious. In some cases, local ordinances were passed that explicitly prohibited Black Americans from owning property or residing within city limits. In others, real estate agents and developers engaged in discriminatory practices, refusing to sell or rent homes to Black families in white neighborhoods. The cumulative effect of these actions was to create communities that were effectively segregated by race, where Black Americans were denied the basic freedoms and opportunities available to their white counterparts. While the overt racism of the sundown town era may seem like a distant memory, its legacy continues to cast a long shadow over American society. Many former sundown towns remain overwhelmingly white today. Their demographics a stark reminder of the exclusionary practices of the past. The economic disparities that were exacerbated by these practices also persist, with Black families often struggling to gain a foothold in communities that were historically off-limits to them. The psychological toll of living under the constant threat of violence and discrimination cannot be overstated. The trauma inflicted on Black families who were forced to flee their homes or who lived in constant fear of being targeted has been passed down through generations. It manifests in distrust of law enforcement, limited economic opportunities, and a sense of alienation from the American dream that was promised to all. Confronting the legacy of sundown towns is not about assigning blame or dwelling on the past. It is about acknowledging a painful truth that has been buried for too long. It is about understanding how historical patterns of discrimination continue to shape our present and influence our future. Only by shining a light on these uncomfortable truths can we begin to heal the wounds of the past and build a more just and equitable society for all. Some communities have taken the important step of formally acknowledging their sundown pasts. They have erected historical markers, organized public forums, and incorporated this history into their school curricula. These efforts, while commendable, are only a starting point. True progress requires a sustained commitment to dismantling the systems of inequality that allowed sundown towns to flourish in the first place. This means addressing racial disparities in housing, education, employment, and criminal justice. It means fostering dialogue and understanding across racial lines. It means embracing our shared history in all its complexity as a necessary step towards creating a more perfect union.